London. This is the latest in the Dr. Popkins Method series of videos in which I'm telling the story of my language learning experience, how I've got fluent in French and Welsh, in Russian and German, and made good progress in several other languages. And I'm trying to find common strands and conclusions that can practically help you with your language learning. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Gareth Popkins. As well as talking about my own language projects, I do quick tips in languages, reviews of language learning material. I cover language learners events in a vlog format, and I've got interviews with inspiring language learners and teachers. So if you haven't subscribed already, please do. It will be great to have you on board. In this video in the Dr. Popkins Method series, I want to look at the key elements which have enabled me to get fluent. So I'm now at the stage of pulling together some strands from the whole of my story. Looking back, one of the things that I've always had, and that I think you need too with your language learning, is really clear motivation. Sometimes there was a need. I needed to pass a French exam when I went off to university to study history. I needed a German qualification to matriculate at Heidelberg University to get a job there. Often though, my own motivation was an intrinsic interest in a culture, in travelling, in using a language, just because I enjoy the experience of communicating, making different noises. And often also, even when I had to learn a language, I needed the exam certificate in Germany, for example, it was because it was part of a wider project, something that I was really wanting to do. With Russian, for example, I needed the language to do my research into Russian history. But also, I wanted to learn this wonderful big language. You need to get clear on your motivation too, I think. And if it's simply that you have to learn the language, for example, because you need to get the citizenship or because your boss has told you to for your job, well, try and find an interest that you can pursue through the language. So if you've got to learn German and you're into fishing, as soon as possible, get into reading blogs about fishing, learning the vocab in that area, and so on. And that way, you might find that an intrinsic motivation is bubbling up from inside as you get into the language. So the first key element, I'd say, for me has been clear motivation. Clear motivation runs into the second key element, which is having a clear vision, an end goal, if you like, for learning the language. I've always had that. And for me, with the languages I've seriously got involved in, it's been to get to a good working knowledge of the language, a really good fluency, so that I can read newspapers, watch films, conduct my daily life through the medium of the language, form friendships and relationships through it. Your goals might be more modest. You might just want enough of the language to get by on holiday, or perhaps you need it in a job when you're dealing with particular clients on the telephone, or perhaps dealing with a specific specialist subject in your work. Whatever it is though, it's great to have the vision of where you want to get, to imagine yourself having succeeded, to hold on to that vision goal as you go. It will help carry you forward through the project and will feed in, of course, to your motivation. It's an aspect, really, I think, of motivation. Now, even if your vision is more modest than mine has tended to be, I bet you're going to want to get up and running quickly. It's something I've always wanted, and the way I have worked has always aimed at doing that. And I've done that in several ways, which I think you should do if you're starting out too. I focus on core structures of the language. So I've usually myself had regular study slots to develop a language habit. So a small amount regularly, and usually using a textbook to give me a framework to make sure that I'm covering core structures and basic vocabulary in a systematic way. Now, I haven't used the textbook passively. I've been really active in using it. So I would do exercises, I would test myself on the book. This is the sort of thing that I now know is what I'd call brain savvy language learning. I'm learning in ways that are supported by what I've read subsequently from cognitive science. But to me, it was sort of logical, maybe because one of my weaknesses is a pretty bad memory, that I knew I had to keep testing myself, doing exercises, because I knew otherwise it would just wash over me. You might not want to work with a textbook. You might like to feel your way in a less structured way, a more ragged way, and that's great because personalities and approaches differ. But you're going to need to be brain savvy as you go. That's to say, making sure that you're testing yourself, that you're elaborating your material, trying to make it your own, retelling stories, for example, forcing yourself to produce language as well. That's the way to get an active command and to get fluent. One of the elements for me in getting fluent has been taking action to deliberately build out my vocabulary in an energetic way. I've done that with the core vocabulary when I'm starting out a language, the most frequently used words, the words that are most relevant to me. And then I've often taken quite a systematic approach because my goal was to get a general fluency. Then working through thematic collections of vocabulary made sense to me. It was relevant. For you, what's relevant will be depending on your goals. But whatever it is, make sure you've got some sort of spaced recall system in place. I now know that that's the brain savvy way to get things into your long-term memory. When I started, I was using paper flashcards. There were no electronic apps around for this purpose at the time. And I was doing it really because I knew I'd got a bad memory, so there was no way I was going to fall for the so-called illusions of learning when you think that just through passive repetition and exposure you're going to learn very much. Now, of course, my motivation wasn't going to help me always on a day-to-day basis, and that's why having a regular habit really has helped me, and also having staging posts along the way. Today I call them path goals. Sometimes they were, for example, to finish a certain number of chapters in a textbook within a certain period of time. But again, you can find relevant ones to set for 2 or 3 months from now, as it were. So not so far away that you can postpone action. But not so near either that you can't really feel any development. It's not long enough to make some real progress, or that time is so short that if life starts getting in the way, you can't. You're thrown completely off track, and there's no time left to close the gap again. The next element, I think, is a lot of listening input. It was difficult for me to get that when I was starting out. I had French, as I explained in an earlier video, from school, and I started listening a lot when I was then really getting serious about French through self-study to the radio in French. It was usually on a medium wave in the evening. It was before the internet. For a long time I couldn't actually understand very much, but because I was working on the vocabulary as well with the flashcards, pretty soon I started to notice that I was understanding more and more. And that really worked great wonders on my motivation. Having good audio materials has been really important for me in my language learning ever since then. The first Welsh textbook I used didn't actually have a cassette with it as it was at the time. And so when I eventually turned up in Wales, because you couldn't pick up Welsh radio where I was living when I started Welsh in Oxford either, and I didn't know any Welsh people, I was rather shocked that my pronunciation was quite out. So for the word isha, for example, to want, I was saying I, she, I, which is a bit more how it's written. With that experience, I now make it a priority to work as much as possible on pronunciation. And of course, it's much easier now with the internet and with far more language materials available all the time to get good audio recordings. And of course, the internet also makes it possible to have access to teachers who can train you in your pronunciation right from the beginning. I also go back and work on my pronunciation every so often to try and root out bad habits, because I don't really have an ear for accents, if you like, at all in my language learning, unfortunately. Visiting countries has been an important motivation for me and an important aspect of my language learning. But what I've generally done, and I explained how this was the case with my Russian and my German, I've lived in both of those countries, was to get a really good grounding in the language, so the basic core structures and the core vocabulary before I went. I've also tended to get chatting relatively late in the day, once I've got those structures and that vocabulary under my belt. Sometimes people may prefer to speak early, and that's something I've been doing more recently. To an extent, I think that boils down to your character as well, the sort of way you want to approach the task. There's not one way. Speak necessarily from day one, or postpone until you've got some language under your belt. But certainly, you have to start speaking if you want to get good at speaking. At some point, you've got to start and get in there using the language. Certainly today, thanks to the internet and the fact that I'm a much more social person than I was previously, do get speaking as early as I can. But I don't want to be inefficient in that. So, you know, for me, having some phrases up my sleeve before I start conversing just seems to make a lot of sense. Getting to the countries has been a planned choice for me, and it was easier for me when I was younger, of course, when I was a student. I didn't have any responsibilities, I had good health, I was able to get travel grants. It can be much harder for us in other stages in our life, but one of the things I noticed when I first went to the Soviet Union was I was meeting people who had learnt English to quite a good level, just relying on the shortwave radio as it was then, and then they couldn't travel to English-speaking countries. So I understood that you could get fluent in a language without necessarily going to the country. One of the things which has been crucial to my success in getting fluent has been insisting on staying in the target language. It's very easy, I think, in some circumstances, particularly for native English speakers, to end up just speaking English, or for anybody really to get stuck in an expat bubble. I've done that by being pretty determined, and also by winning the confidence, I think, of the people I'm speaking with, by sort of prioritising speed and good intonation, perhaps, over accuracy, grammatical accuracy, by being prepared to duck and dive as I speak, using fillers to keep the conversation moving, phrases like, you know what I mean, that sort of thing, you know, moving the conversation forward, and also talking around, describing things when I don't have the vocabulary. There are strategies we can learn, I think, to keep the conversation moving. They might differ from language to language. That's part of tuning in to the culture. Other aspects of that are getting on top of the different styles that there are to communicate in different languages. Things like the formal and informal forms of speech, where the first names are used. In Russian, you have a patronymic, for example. Different rhetorical styles. The Russians are often much more florid in their greetings. For example, if it's somebody's birthday, there's a whole different culture of how you do toasts if you're at a meal. Learning all these things is one of the fascinations of language learning, and something you need to focus on. Again, it's about tuning in if you want to communicate successfully. And the further on I've got as well, the more I've got into a culture, I've started to realise that, you know, much of what we say and how we think is informed by the history of the language. You can have phrases coming in from films. Lots of English phrases come from Shakespeare, for example, or from other great literary figures. Even adverts, of course, can bring in phrases. And the better I've got at the different languages, the more I've tuned in, the more satisfying it sort of felt to start to get some of these references. You see, for me, and I think this is a real important element, learning languages has always involved playing a long game. Of course, I want to make the quick wins as soon as possible, but for me, because I have set as my goal getting a good knowledge and a good fluency in the language, I've known that it's going to be really a lifelong engagement, a multifaceted thing with new satisfactions and motivations emerging over time, rather like as you turn a kaleidoscope and the colours are all there, but they're mixed in a different way. I've kept travelling, and over the long term, I've also maintained friendships in languages quite deliberately, and I've done the work to do that, keep in touch with people. And, now even have friends who have their own children who I'm getting to know. So it's been sort of getting fluent in a number of decades in some ways. And there's always more to do when you're learning a language. I think the elements I've outlined today should be pretty central to anybody's language learning. But obviously, how I've learnt languages reflects my circumstances and my personality. I'm quite methodical, I'm a bit of a technophobe, I didn't have access to a lot of the technology we have now at the beginning, and I've always wanted to get to a high level in the languages that I've been learning. Your personality and your goals may be quite different. I still hope that you've found these high-level elements helpful and that they make sense to you. If there are others that you'd add or things you disagree with, questions you have, please let me know in the comments below. In the next and final video in the Dr. Popkins Method series, I want to look at 4 guiding principles which I think you can apply to your language learning at every level, whatever your goals and whatever your personality. So look out for the final video in the Dr. Popkins Method series. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.